Wait till you turn it over to me. So I wanted to I'm just going to quickly stop sharing my screen, Chris, and close my emails because I had meant to make sure they were quit before I started, just so we don't get the dinging.
Hi, everyone. So we're going to get started in maybe 1 to 2 minutes. We'll just see if there's any more people who want to come into the room. And then we'll get started probably around 6:32 or so. So hi, everyone. Welcome tonight. We'll probably get 1 or 2 more stragglers in, but for anybody who is new or hasn't been on any of these webinars before, I'm Chris Baskies. I'm the membership manager at the Ontario Cycling Association. I'm happy to have you guys here today. We've been doing a club summit, usually in person prior to the COVID-19 situation. But in 2020, we sort of transitioned to a webinar-based format. It seems to be a better delivery tool to the entire province with some of these topics. So tonight, I'm happy to have Cheryl Humphrey from Sport Law. Cheryl is going to be doing a presentation tonight on engaging and retaining volunteers, whether that is through your club or your member-based organization. If you have any questions, please feel free to type them, put them in the Q&A. I will be monitoring that throughout Cheryl's presentation and either asking her when there's a break in her presentation or at the end any of your questions. So please don't hesitate to put any of those in there. As well, just a reminder that this is being recorded. So once this is done, the OCA will be posting this to our YouTube page along with some of our previous club webinars from last year and other years, so that you can basically take a look at those in your free time. So enough about me. I will pass it on to Cheryl, and Cheryl, feel free to introduce yourself to everyone.
Great. Well, thank you, Chris. And thank you, everybody, for taking time out of your busy schedules after a long weekend and joining us for an hour and maybe a little bit this evening to walk through some items on how we can engage and retain volunteers. As Chris said, my name is Cheryl Humphrey. I joined Sport Law actually just in the fall of 2021, although I've had a career in the not-for-profit voluntary and sports sector for in excess of 25 years now. I always hate as that number grows a little bit behind me, but started out really doing a lot of work more so in the not-for-profit sector and within the municipal recreation, and spent a good part or chunk of my career around supporting organizations in developing capacity, as well as in engaging and working with volunteers. A number of years ago, I was fortunate to work on the national initiative, the Voluntary Sector Initiative, that occurred, I think it was early 2000s, so it was quite a while ago now, and have spent a good deal of my career working in alongside some of the volunteer centers across the country. The last 10 plus years, I've been more immersed in sport as an executive director of a provincial sport organization, and then stepped away last fall to join the team at Sport Law, where I could put my skills and experiences to use in different ways, mostly around working with organizations around strategic planning, governance, policy systems, and change management. But the volunteer management piece from early history has a sort of a special place in my heart, and hopefully I'll be able to share a little bit of information with you today to spark some ideas or give you some ways to maybe look at things a little differently and take a couple things away from the session. Just a little bit about Sport Law, who we are. So we're a team now of, I think, close to 20 team members across the country, from Halifax all the way up to Victoria. What we love to do is to help working with sport organizations. Really, our vision is to elevate sport. And we do that in a number of different ways through leadership and coaching, human relations. We have lawyers on board, so a whole team of legal services that we can provide, governance and risk management solutions, as well as planning and some financial solutions, communications and marketing, and some of the Ready or EDI work through the inclusive solutions. So a broad range of services to really support sport organizations and clubs like yourselves and PSOs like Cycling Ontario to really help them deliver what they are to deliver through their mandate. So it's an exciting organization to be a part of, and we get to do a lot of real great work as we work with sport across the country. I shared this very quickly, what we value, because we'll touch on values really briefly in the presentation, but when we do our work at Sport Law, we value empathy, delivery, and stewardship. So we try to bring that to the work we do. I'm not going to go through it line by line, but it gives you a little bit of a sense of our guiding principles and how we like to work with our clients as we go forward. What I thought we would cover today is really an overview of volunteering. I have some information that I can share a little bit around sort of a scan of what volunteer looks like across the country. We'll spend a little bit of time looking at recruitment, and a little bit around screening, so tailoring to the role, as well as some time on recognition and retention. And then I will save a little bit of time at the end to talk a little bit about board succession planning, because as we know, boards are volunteers as well too. And then I'll leave some time if there's any questions. As Chris said, as we're working through things, if you have questions that pop up, feel free to put them in the chat box. Chris has offered to monitor that for me, and he'll make sure that the questions come forward so that we can address some of the things that are burning in your minds or ideas that are coming forward. So really our learning objectives as we close out the night, hopefully you'll be able to leave being able to identify some Canadian trends in volunteerism and the impacts that these trends can have on involving volunteers in your club. Explore some recruitment strategies and the importance of screening our volunteers. Identify ways to foster volunteer commitment and retention, and how we can empower the work that we we do with volunteers, learn what motivates individuals and how you can use those motivations to influence volunteer involvement, and then discuss the importance of appropriate recognition and how this can be a tool as well for volunteer retention. So my first question for you, and this you can put in the chat box if you would like, or take a moment, just take a couple moments before you do that to think about your own experiences as a volunteer. And the first experience I would like you to think about was a negative experience, or maybe not so positive of an experience that you had as a volunteer. And then I'd also like you to recall an experience that you had that was quite positive. And when you reflect on both those, what was negative, what was it about that experience that made it negative? And when you think about that volunteer experience that really lit you up or made you really feel like you had a real sense of connection to what you were doing and was positive, what was that experience that made it positive? And if you would take a few minutes and maybe just drop it into the chat, and Chris and I can take a look at some of those. So what was it that made the experience negative for you? We'll start there, and then maybe explore a little bit about what made it positive. Everybody might just be enjoying their dinner through the dinner hour right now. Negative, volunteering is often thankless and very little recognition is given, right? So Angela's looking a little bit for that recognition of a job well done. Negative, unreasonable expectations of volunteers. So we put too much requirements or have too many things that we're expecting them to do. Another one was not knowing what was expected, right? So those are some great examples. And those are ones that I would say that we hear quite often, right? So another one was negative was when left alone without instruction. Another negative, positive feedback was non-existent, right? So we didn't hear, you know, what we were doing that was well and how it contributed, and no appreciation, again, that recognition, right? So as we think of some of these negative experiences, and we've all had them, I've had them too, what I would challenge you to think about as we go through the session tonight, what can we do to take what you may have experienced as a negative situation as a volunteer and turn it into a positive for somebody else? So what are the steps or strategies or processes that we can put in place to make sure that others don't have that negative experience? And all the idea or all the negative experiences that you guys have shared here, we will address in some format or in some way tonight as we go through the presentation. When you think about a positive experience and think of a time that was a real good experience for you as a volunteer, what was it that made it positive? So what were some of the things that made it positive? So we have here understanding what results the organizer was expecting, plus a thank you for your time spent or for the organization. So again, that acknowledgement and understanding what it is that I'm here to do, right? Like, what is my role? Do I have a clear role? The other people volunteering together. So the social aspect, right? So oftentimes that's a really important piece for people as they come together because they actually want to be interacting with others and have that opportunity to do so. Anything else that comes to mind around a positive experience? New friendships. So again, that social piece, right? That sense of connection to others and maybe that sense of connection to the organization. Those are great examples. Wonderful. Acknowledgement, watching others grow from what they've learned via your volunteering, right? So that growth of others, how you're contributing, that you're actually making an impact, right? Is what I heard there. Incentives to return back and volunteer more, swag. So the thank you gifts, right? The little things that make us feel that it was a job well done. Chris has added here, gain new skills, right? So that can be a big one for many volunteers is they're actually wanting to contribute in a way so that they're learning as well too. So it may not be that they're wanting to share a skill, but they're trying to gain or develop new skills. So again, great. So as we think about all these positive experiences that we've had, let's maybe think as we go through the presentation, how we can make sure that as we're thinking about involving and retaining volunteers, how we create some of those positive aspects for them as well too. Thank you very much for sharing. That was wonderful. So now we actually, before we dive in, we're going to start off with a test or a quiz. And I bet you, none of you thought you'd have to do a quiz tonight, but this is all in fun. So a little bit to test your knowledge about the landscaping of volunteering across the country. So Chris has a poll question he's going to throw up. And if it doesn't work, that's great, because you got it here in the PowerPoint. So what is the percentage of Canadians over 15 years that volunteer either formally or informally? So if you want to log your answers there. So the first is 89%, 79%, 49%, or 29%. So, and I think, Chris, you can maybe do a count to make sure that we've got a good number of the people that have responded.
Yes, we've got 8 of 11 so far.
Okay, so we'll do just another couple seconds here, and then we can dive into the answer. So a good mix here. It looks like 29% is the leading number, D, and it's growing here. Followed by 89%, and then almost a tie there for B and C, 79 and 49. So let's take a look at the answer here. The answer is B, so it's 79%. I think what's key here when you think of this number at that 79%, it is because in 2018, what they did is they did a survey, the government did a survey, and they actually looked at both formal and informal volunteering, or a combination of both. So that formal volunteering is what we often think of, right? It's the signing up to do a task at the club, maybe going down to your local food bank to work a shift or an hour there, maybe doing some volunteering in your church or your local community group. The informal volunteering is more that I shovel my neighbor's walk next door because they are more elderly and they can't get out in the snow, right? Or I maybe stop to help someone. So it's not necessarily formally done through an organization. So that question can be a little bit misleading because it's actually tracking both formally and informal volunteers. What's interesting when we look at this is that what the stats show us from 2018 is that those that volunteer actually dedicated close to 5 billion hours in volunteer activities. So that's 2.5 million full-time year-round jobs. So that's quite a high number, a high commitment when you think from an economic impact, right? That's being contributing. What we know too is that what tends to happen is that our younger generation, so that iGens, are more likely to engage in formal volunteering. So the chart at the bottom actually speaks specifically around formal volunteering, not the combination, but they'll contribute less hours. And as you go up sort of the scale, so those born 1918 to 45, some more of those matures, less time to volunteer, but the hours that they give are substantially higher. So an individual volunteer are 222 hours. I think the millennials is probably where our group of parents sit right now with anyone that's involved in sport activities, right? So that's 1981 to that 1995, or actually that would be our Gen Xers, sorry. And so again, kind of that mid-range of volunteering and contributing probably about 120 hours, right? And again, these are also maybe that generation that's a little bit strapped for time too. So meaning that they may be working. We all know what it's like if we're involved in sports with our kids and the running and the activities that we do with our kids, right? And it's as that transition changes, as we move maybe more into our retirement years, or more when the kids leave the house and not involved as intensively in some of those activities, we can actually begin to contribute more hours to those things that are meaningful to us. So I share this because it's going to give us a little bit of some information when we look at sort of what motivates volunteers and how we can look to begin to identify who's good for which roles that we're looking at. The next poll that I'll ask Chris to pop up is among those that formally volunteer for an organization. So this is that formal volunteering, not the mix. What is the average hours per year that individuals volunteered for sport and recreation organizations? So specifically just to sport and recreation organizations. So A would be 275, B would be 205 hours, C is 105, and then D is 75 hours. So I'll give you a few minutes just to log what you think the answer might be. And it looks like the leading one here is 105 hours. So let's take a look here at the answer. And those that answered 105 hours are correct. So sport and recreation, the top 4 sort of activities are those that volunteer within the hospital setting. Religious organizations top out at about 110, sport and recreation 105, and arts and culture follow really closely at around 104 behind that. So that kind of gives you an idea of sort of the breakdown and where people 15 and older may be looking at putting some of their time, and some of that too could be dictated again by the activities that our kids are involved. A lot of times when we're involved in sport organizations, and probably you experience it as well too in cycling, there's sort of oftentimes a requirement or a commitment to volunteer as well too. So that would be captured in these hours as well. So I have one more poll quiz for you, and then we'll move on to some of the more theory and some of the practical stuff that you guys can use. So the last poll question is among formal volunteering, what is most commonly reported activity that people volunteer for? So the first one, A, is sitting on a board or committee. Answer B is collecting, servicing, or delivering food. C is teaching, educating, or mentoring. And then D would be organizing events and fundraising. So of those activities, where do you think people are contributing the most hours? All right, so it looks like the top one here is organizing events and raising funds. And I would say that certainly aligns. And this is a really hard slide to see, so I apologize for the blurriness of it. But 18% of those that volunteer are actually volunteering to organize and supervise events. What's interesting is coaching, refereeing, and officiating is on here as well too. You'll see it. I think it's 4th from the bottom there. So it's 6%, right? So probably quite a bit lower than we might think within some of the sport organizations, but you can see that anyone that may be organizing an event, fundraising, sitting on a board or a committee, 13. So a lot of those activities are where people are putting the bulk of their time, and likely because that's where we're requiring the most volunteers, right, as we're looking for that. So what I would share around the importance of trends is and why I shared it sort of in this format at the top of the presentation is I think it provides a little bit of an idea and a little bit of guidance for us about what volunteers may be seeking, how they're contributing, and what you can begin to expect as you begin to look at how you want to involve volunteers in your club, right? So again, it's just a tool that you can use so that you can see some of the, you know, the age of volunteers, who contributes the most, and the type of activities that they're currently involved in. So I'll pause there just for a sec to see if I don't think there's been any questions or anything come up, Chris. So.
Nothing as of yet.
All right, so let's
You've done a fantastic job.
There we go. Let's take a little look at recruitment, and I have to chuckle when I put this picture up, and sort of share this phrase, like, would you eat at a restaurant whose ad read, please eat here because we have all this food we have to sell. But often don't we feel like that's what we do as we're trying to find volunteers, please come and do this task for us. We need it done. And I chuckle because I'm based in Alberta, so in Calgary. And I think it was last week or on the weekend, I was flipping through my community newsletter that comes out. It's called Community League, right? Community Association. And it had this plea on there, right? Like, please come and volunteer for this activity or we're going to have to shut it down. And I've often thought, like, what a way to recruit people, because when I read that, I'm not raising my hand to get involved. I'm kind of backing away a little bit, right? Because, and same with the restaurant, you wouldn't eat at a restaurant that said, please come and eat here because we have all this food we have to sell. You want to go to a restaurant that, describes kind of maybe the ambiance that you're in or the type of food or the experience that you're going to have, right? So think of that too, when we're thinking about recruiting for volunteers and appreciating as well. I appreciate that probably all of you in your role here tonight are volunteers that are looking at how we can place volunteers. So my guess is the vast majority of you are in that place. So I recognize that. So why is recruitment important? And it's important for a couple of reasons versus sort of the warm body or we have all this food to sell method. Your club has goals that it wants to achieve, right? So there is a mission, a mandate, an activity or an event that you're running has a specific goal that it's looking at achieving. And by ensuring that we're actually recruiting or placing the right person in the right role that's been carefully planned, we know that that's going to assist your club in meeting the goals. You also want the best people for the job, right? So recruiting isn't just about placing anybody into a position or the first person that raises their hand, although often that's what we're feeling like we have to do. It's actually about placing the right person whose skills and experience and maybe their motivations match the need of that role or that position. And when you guys shared at the top of the presentation some of your negative experience, some of that was coming out in what I read in some of those experiences that you had. It also allows you to use your resources the most effective way, right? So especially if you as volunteers are looking at how do we involve volunteers in our organization in different way, you want to make sure it's done in a way that's less time consuming for you and that you're not putting people in roles where it's not working out and then you're having to look at, okay, I have to fill that position again or recruit another volunteer into that role. So taking a little bit of time up front will actually help you a little bit, I think, as you begin to get the right people in the right roles. Utilize also what you know about some of the trends that we talked about as well too. So some of that information around trends will actually begin to lay that foundation for some of the pieces we want to think about around recruiting. So when we look at recruiting, I would say there's sort of four main motivations, and you guys shared these in your experiences at the top of the presentation as well too. So it's understanding what motivates people to volunteer. So gain experience could be one, learn a new skill, a desire to use a skill would be another one, believe in the cause, social interaction. And I think we saw all of those in some of those examples you guys provided from a positive experience, right? So some wanted to actually hone in or develop a skill. Some had a skill they wanted to use, and they wanted to share it with others. We saw a lot around the social interaction, making friendships, right? So understanding what motivates people may actually help as you're looking at the various roles that you have within your club, who would be a good fit. So for example, if we have someone that loves the social interaction, I'm here, I want to make friends, it's all I can do to interact with people, we might not want to put them, kind of at a place in the middle of a route or something where they don't get that chance to interact with individuals, but maybe at that start or the finish of the ride, I don't know if you guys hand out refreshments or beverages at the end, or there's a little bit of that social interaction that happens, but a place where they can actually do that, right? If you have, for example, someone that's wanting to learn or develop skills. And these could be people within your club. And we'll talk a little bit too about maybe looking out outside of the club where we could pull individuals in. Maybe it's a university student or a high school student that actually is trying to develop some skills, and having them involved in one of your events or planning or fundraising would actually give them some skills that they could use down the road. And they're going to be committed because they're actually motivated to try to use that skill. So as you're looking at those different motivations, then the other piece that we have to look at is that each motivation, there could be a different strategy to how we begin to identify what may be good roles to place people in. So the first one is around who they are. And that really speaks again to what's motivating them. Right. The next one is where are they? And we talked a little bit about this. So they can be within your club. It could be that you're reaching outside of your club to find someone that may be able to assist again in that fundraising activity, that event that you're looking at, that planning or implementing. That doesn't necessarily always need to be from within the club. But if you understand the motivations and you understand the role that you're looking for, you're better able to identify who they are and where it is that you might find them. The other element is around, for a strategy, is around looking at needs and motivations, right? So again, if we're placing them based on their motivations, greater chance that they're going to be successful, they're going to enjoy the experience, and they're going to stay connected to the organization. The other piece to look at is around their needs. So time, interest, other. So again, if we have someone that doesn't have a lot of flexibility in their time, we may need to look at a role or how they can contribute their volunteer in ways that supports that inability to be flexible just because of the nature of their job. You know, if they're a single mom, that type of thing, or a single parent that may not have that same flexibility, right? Working parent trying to juggle things. So again, take that into consideration, right? That comes, one of the negative experiences that we heard at the top of the call was around expectations. Well, time expectations is an important piece as well too. And then it's about how do we reach them? So we have an idea around what motivates them. We have an idea of who they are. Are they within the club, outside of the club? You know, would they be someone that has planning skills, maybe someone that likes to interact with others, you know, at the finish line or as we're pulling people together for a ride, right? And then we can begin to define how we reach them, right? Whether that be through emails, through the friendly network that you have with each other. If it's outside your organization, it could be through your local high schools, universities, volunteer centers. A lot of communities have volunteer centers that you can reach out to, and they will post for you volunteer opportunities as well too. The number one recruitment method for people to volunteer is they will come to volunteer because they've been asked to contribute. So regardless of a lot of the different things that we do, the number one reason people get involved is that they were asked to come and be a part of the activity or the event that was going on. And we'll talk a little bit about that too around when we look to retain them. The other critical element I would say when you're looking at this again is matching that right person to the right role. And I think that understanding of the different motivations kind of gives you guys an idea of how that may be an important piece as well too. So I'll pause there on recruitment. And what I would maybe ask, and again, you can put this in the chat, is what has worked well in your organization? So what are some of the things or within your club around recruitment that you've found that has been quite successful for you? If anything, and again, you can just pop it in the chat there for others to glean from. Asking people at an incentive program for ride leaders. Great. Yeah. And what does that incentive program look like? Would it be that they would have reduced membership fees or perks, or what is the incentive program that you would be offering? Use of our club website to share their information and request help. Okay. Anything else there that's worked for folks? We give a first aid course. Perfect. So that training and orientation, right? So it's giving back to the volunteers, a discount on membership. So perfect. These are some great examples of how we can, making it not mandatory. Did I read that? It's instead of encouraging a culture of volunteering. So again, that's great, right? A lot of times we hear about the carrot, right? And the stick. Sometimes I think the carrot works better, right? Some jerseys, right? Sponsored gift cards. So that's great. These are all great examples of how you're using that method to recruit to actually identify how you're going to acknowledge that volunteer, and they have a sense of connection back to things. Making it mandatory felt hard. Yeah, it can, right? So no one likes to be told what to do, right? So for years, I had kids that were involved in swimming. So I was a swimming official for years, and I mean, there's 40 officials on the pool deck. So, I mean, that's something we need to look at through all of this pandemic element is, can we do things differently, right? And I would often have, there's a level of frustration for those that consistently didn't volunteer, but I always said, what, you know, why would we want them on the pool deck if they don't want to be there? Like, we actually want to be surrounded by people that want to contribute, that want to be there. Making it mandatory probably isn't in the best interest of the kids who are really here for mostly, or for the other members if you're running an adult club also, right? So so some great ideas there that you guys have shared, so thank you. So let's take a look at screening. And this, I share this because this is still a fairly, I would say, a critical element to volunteer and to non-volunteer roles within any sport organization. So it would apply equally to whether it's a volunteer position or a paid position. But screening practices are ongoing and they go beyond the selection process. So often when we think of screening, our minds immediately go to police record checks or vulnerable searches, right? That's immediately where we go. But what I would offer is that screening actually promotes better volunteer matching. So we get improved quality of safety of programs and reduce our risks and liability. So a number of years ago, screening is far more than a police record check. A number of years ago, Volunteer Canada actually created 10 steps to screening. So they had sort of their safe 10 steps that they initialized. And these, glean from this what you can. Again, for some roles that you may have, it may feel like it's too much, but there may be elements in each of these steps that I think would apply, and it will begin to demonstrate that screening is far more than police record checks. The other piece that I would add here before I go on to the next screen and the 10 steps is screening policies should be in place for your organization. My guess is probably Chris or Cycling Ontario has a screening policy that they utilize, and I would say that equally important are to make sure that those screening policies are within your clubs as well too, especially if you're working with youth and especially if you potentially have other vulnerable individuals that may be a part of your club setting. So the 10 steps of screening are, the first one is around assessment or risk analysis. And what this is it is really just taking a brief look at that position and it's in the setting that that position will be in and identifying any risks. So is it a setting or a position where it requires that we're one-on-one with an individual? In that case, we're probably looking at how we can apply the rule of two, right? Or is it in a setting that's open and observable to all, right? Which may mean then it's a lower risk for anything happening, and some of what you may need to put in place from a screening perspective may not need to be as in-depth. So take a look at that, sort of a brief risk analysis. What is the position and where is the environment that the activity will take place? The second one is around the position or the assignment. And this is really around, where possible, use role descriptions or terms of references. And again, I appreciate that for every volunteer role, this may feel cumbersome. But I do believe, and again, it goes back to that expectations that someone shared at the top where they felt that they had a negative experience. Your position description, even if it's a brief, will provide for what the expectations of that role are, right? Within that position description, you should also indicate any of the screening requirements or tools that you may be using, whether it's police record checks, driver abstracts, vulnerable sector checks, right? Reference checks, that type of thing as well too. And again, for those volunteers that may be working with vulnerable individuals, it's a really critical piece. The second step is around recruitment. So, and again, this really speaks to where possible, develop a fair and consistent system as you're bringing people into your organization or involving them in different roles, right? Include key information about the organization and the position, and sort of any key communication around some of maybe your values, your policies, that type of thing that you may have. If you can, and again, it's not going to be suitable for every volunteer position, but again, those that are working with those that are vulnerable, any type of application form or process, right? Where you're requesting sort of that standard information or specific information related to the position. What this begins to do, if you actually have some of these pieces in place, these steps, it will actually start to weed out. Also, too, people will weed themselves out because they'll actually see that as an organization, you're taking your duty of care quite seriously. And so they'll step away from organizations where they know they can't step in and do harm. Where an interview can be conducted, and I'm not talking about the corporate interview necessarily where we sit down and there's, the big board table, but, are there some specific questions that you can ask? Because what this does is too, it helps you understand the motivations when we talked about that piece around recruitment, right? What it is that the volunteer is looking for. It'll also help you assess sort of information about that individual around suitability, right? So again, it doesn't need to be that formal corporate interview, but even 3 or 4 key questions that get to what it is that you're trying to achieve. Where possible, and again, depending on that position, reference checks you may want to use, right, to make sure that the person has the skills and the experience that they claim they have, especially if they're coming from outside of the club or even within the club. Oftentimes we don't know people on a personal basis within the club as well as we think we do. The next step is around police checks and other checks. So other checks could be your vulnerable sector check. Again, really important if you're working with anybody that is a minor or underage or other vulnerable individuals. Other tools can be screening questionnaires. So there are, a set of questions that you can ask, because if you do police record checks every 2 or 3 years, you can actually have within your screening policy where if an individual is convicted of a crime that they have to self-disclose. And sometimes those screening questionnaires that can be implemented easier on a yearly basis can disclose some of that. They've been involved in a sport tribunal before. Have they been convicted of anything or being investigated for anything? The other check that you can do is a driver's abstract as well too. So this would be and I don't know in your situation, but if you're transporting individual or club members, right? So if there's, a common, renting of a vehicle to drive people to, an activity or an event or a cycling event, right? And it's the volunteer that's actually responsible for transporting some of the members of the clubs, you can ask for that as a screening mechanism. The 8th step is around orientation and or training. Again, there may be certification levels that are required for cycling, and Chris can probably provide a little bit more information on that through the NCCP program and what that may look like for you guys from a cycling perspective. But again, it doesn't need to be a full day orientation, but are we giving people the tools so that they can do the job or the volunteer role in the most effective and efficient way, right? So that orientation can be that simple. The training could be some certification that they may have if they're involved in coaching. I would say the other element around screening is support and supervision. And again, I believe this came up as a negative, as one of our negative examples. Do individuals have a place they can go to if they have questions, right? Is there a mechanism to have feedback, both that the volunteer can provide to the club and that the club can provide back to the volunteer. Where can they go to? And then I would say the 10th one is around follow-up and feedback. And this can be, you know, feedback from participants, feedback from members. If you're dealing with youth or minors, it could be feedback from the family members to get a sense for you know, how that person is performing in the role, especially if they're leading a ride or they're doing a lot of sort of work with a group of individuals or athletes at any one time. So those are the 10 steps of screening that Volunteer Canada put out a number of years ago. They have stayed consistent. They haven't changed. Again, depending on your situation and environment, it may feel like that's a lot of information to do when we just want to recruit somebody to hand out juice at the finish line, right? But that is where that risk assessment or that risk analysis at the top, where we begin to identify that, you know, that individual or that type of volunteer role is going to have lots of people around them all the time. And we may not need to go through all 10 steps to place someone in that role. Where if you have a coach or someone that may be working really closely with athletes or members in your club, some of these pieces as a volunteer and as a paid staff would become more important.
Hi, Cheryl. So there is
Yeah.
a question in the Q&A. The question is there any significant liability distinction for an organization between engaging volunteers or employees?
I would say no. So if I understand the question, so I would say that whether you're utilizing volunteers or whether you're utilizing paid staff, other than the employment standards that you would have around notice, minimum pay, that type of thing, I would say that especially when you're working with vulnerable individuals, some of that same duty of care that we have in our due diligence around staff and onboarding staff and recruiting staff would be very similar to volunteers. Right? So you don't have maybe necessarily the legal or the employment standards that you're dealing with, but you're still, in many cases, probably putting individuals, members, minors, you know, to be trusted with an individual that you may be onboarding as a volunteer. And that's why you'll see, I think, that the 10 steps to screening from a volunteer perspective that's been shared here, probably very similar to what you think of when you think about recruiting in the employment world or the work world as well too, right? So it's mirrored in that way. Does that answer the question?
I believe so, but I'm sure we'll hear if it doesn't.
Okay, all right, perfect.
Feel free to follow up with another question if that didn't answer your question.
Yeah, please do. All right, anything else on the screening safe steps before we move to retention? All right, so let's take a look at retention. So remember when we talked about recruitment and we talked about the number one reason people will volunteer is because they've been asked. The number one reason that people stay involved is that they feel a sense of connection to the organization, the purpose, or the cause. And I think that was shared in some of our negative and positive experiences as well at the top of the presentation, right? So they become involved because they were asked. They stay involved because they feel a sense of connection to the club, to what the club is trying to do, or to the cause in this case, right? So when we think about that and we think about retention really is about empowering your volunteers. So you've gone to all of the work around identifying, you know, the roles that you need, making sure that we're getting the right people in the right roles. And now they're in those roles. How do we make sure that we're empowering them to do their best work and feeling like they're fully contributing to the organization? A lot of these will seem pretty simple to you, but they're sort of important elements. So the first one is understanding what your mission of your organization or your club is. And when we think back to the previous slide, right, they stay involved because they feel a sense of connection to the organization or the purpose. It's because they feel like they're contributing to the purpose, which is the mission of your organization. So if you have that clearly articulated and can demonstrate in the best way possible how they're contributing, it empowers them to do their job, just like it would empower employees to do their jobs as well too, and they can see that direct link to the mission. The other piece that I think is important, it's partially why I shared the values of sport law at the top of the presentation as well too, is we can empower them by making sure that we share what our values are as an organization or a club. So I don't know if all of the clubs under the umbrella of Cycling Ontario have gone through that exercise of creating what your values may be as an organization, but they really become the guiding principles for how we interact, how we deliver our programs, how we deliver our services, and how we are interacting with each other. And volunteers will connect to that, or paid staff, or anybody, if they feel a connection back to the values of your organization. The other way that you can empower your volunteers is by being consistent, right? And some of the tools and some of the things that we talked about previously begin to provide some of that consistency, right? So that volunteers are treated equitably, right? Maybe not equally, but equitably within the program. If we have incentive programs for some volunteers, are there incentive programs for another level of volunteer within your organization, or maybe not level's the wrong word, but a volunteer doing other roles within your organization? So how are we ensuring that that consistency is across the board and everybody is aware of it? The fourth way that we can empower our volunteers is ensure their safety. Right? So everybody, especially in this day and age, needs to be able to feel like they're in an environment that is safe, right? Whether that be from all the pandemic stuff that we're dealing with, or just safe around being fully involved and belonging within the organization, and making sure too that, you know, any safety protocols are followed, or that they're aware of them, right? Or provided training around them. So that safety piece can be broad reaching. The fourth way that we can empower, or fifth way we can empower our volunteers, is provide role expectations and descriptions. And again, this was shared at the top of the presentation around a negative experience. Didn't know what I was supposed to do, right? So again, appreciating that a lot of you are the volunteers that are recruiting the volunteers, right? But is there systems or processes that we can put in place for some of those key roles that you use repeatedly, that, you know, on an ongoing basis, that we can begin to define what some of the expectations of the roles are, and what the role requirements or the descriptions is, right? And is there a way within the network of cycling clubs that you can maybe begin to share that with each other, so that you're not all creating some of the same things over and over? Or maybe that's a role that Cycling Ontario can support some of the clubs in as well too. But providing that so that there's a clear expectation. It's just like in your work world, if you know exactly what it is that you're supposed to do and what the expectations are, you're going to rise up to that as well too, and be empowered to do your job. I would say the next one is around ensuring appropriate placements. We talked a little bit about this at the top when we talked about motivations, right? And the right fit. And again, the best way that we can empower people is making sure that they're in a volunteer role that really suits them and their motivations and their needs, right? That they're not overwhelmed by it, that if they're looking to feel challenged by developing new skills, that they may have that opportunity to do that, and that they actually feel like they're contributing. Offering training and or orientation. And again, this doesn't need to be a full day training. Someone offered that they provided first aid training, right? Which is probably a critical element around that safety piece. But are there things that your clubs can put in place so that, again, the volunteers have the tools to do the roles that have been outlined for them? Providing feedback, another key one. And the feedback could be as simple as, that was a great job. I love the way you set up that ride, or that the tour that we did today, or, you know, any feedback, both positive and negative. And the negative can be delivered in a way more as a growth or a learning, but providing feedback, again, empowers everybody, because we want to learn and we want to do a good job. And if there's nothing worse than when we miss the mark, right? If we're not told, you know, we want to make sure so that we're contributing and feeling that sense of connection. I would say the other way is to share information. So as organizations, or, you know, as people bringing volunteers in, to the best of your ability, make sure everybody has the information they need, not only to do their job, but feel a sense of connection to the bigger picture. You know, if it's multiple roles within an event, or a fundraising activity that you're doing, or a competition or a ride, they can see where all the pieces fit together so that it's beyond just their specific role, but the bigger picture. I would say the other critical element around empowering is share the workload, right? So there's nothing worse than giving your time. You show up to do something and you realize that the person next to you is doing all the work and there's really not much for you to do, right? So, is there a way that we can make sure that everybody has a piece to what they need to do so that that activity feels fulfilling to them and is empowering, right? And the reverse of that is making sure that one person isn't feeling overwhelmed so that they get to the place where they give up, they walk away, right? Because it's been too much for them. And I would say the final way that we can empower our volunteers is express appreciation. And from volunteer to volunteer, that could just be a simple thank you. It sounds like there's some great incentive programs that some of the clubs are running. And I would say when you think of expressing that appreciation, think about how you can link that back maybe to what motivates that volunteer, because that appreciation could simply be gaining that skill, right? For that person that wants that social interaction, that appreciation is going to be that they're in an environment where they can actually be meeting people and interacting and having conversations, right? So again, that appreciation piece is a critical piece to empowering your volunteers. Any questions on that before I move on to the board? All right, so board succession planning. So we could do 2 hours on governance. So this is like the 20,000 foot view I'm going to give you today. But I recognize that as board members, and many of you on the webinar tonight are probably board members, right? And so, and as board members, we're all volunteers, right? And I would say what I've observed in my times as leading a PSO and being involved in some sport clubs is those presidents of any club, they commit a lot of their time to making sure that things run well within their club. So thank you to the board members that have stepped forward. So some of the things you can think about around board succession planning and some tips. I would say the first one is around size and composition of your board. So I would say really think about what is the role of committees and what is the role of a board. So oftentimes at the club level, we will have what we call working boards, right? Because we often don't have staff within our clubs. Some of your larger clubs may have staff that can do some of the work, but we find we really do have boards that are working boards and that they are doing some of the work, right? So I would say is some of that work that takes place at that board meeting, because we've all sat through 3 and 4 hour board meetings, right? Which we walk out of there feeling like it was not always a great use of our time. Is there a way that we can segment some of that work off so that there are committees that are supporting the board, and that some of the committee reports, the work is being done outside of the board table, right, around other tables or smaller tables, and those committees are reporting into the board so that the flow of the work and the operations of the club all stay intact. So I would say think really hard about that size and who's doing what, and as well the size of your board. So I would say at the local level, and what the Canadian Olympic Committee has as governance standards, they're looking really at that 7 to 9 as being the ideal number of boards, a board size. But if you have a working board, you're actually going to see that number probably need to increase maybe to that 9 to 11 range. But again, if it's structured in such a way that activities aren't always taking place around that board table, chances are that you will need a smaller board, because the board still has the function of the board, which is that governing role versus the programming role as well too. So I would say think about that. I would also think about whether through your board meetings, if we still need to meet on a monthly basis, right? Or if the board is really just doing the work of the board and we have a couple other subcommittees that are doing some of the programming elements, can a board look to meet every 6 to 8 weeks instead of monthly, right? Again, it's that time commitment that people have to give and that feeling of connection or purpose to the organization. I would say another key element around board succession planning, and again, this is around how we bring people onto the board as volunteers. I would really start to look at, as best we can at the local level and a provincial level, around how we might be able to use nomination committees versus from the floor, right? I would say when we do nominations from the floor, which has been a practice for several years, and again, clubs very lean to this quite a bit just because of the structure of their bylaws. We don't necessarily know who's coming into the organization or who's putting their hand up, right? And we've all been in those AGMs where all the heads go down when the nominations go up, because you know if you look up, you're going to be pulled onto the board, right? So by using a nominations committee, you can actually have a better look at some of the skill sets on the board, what you're looking for, and being able to recruit people prior to that AGM. I would say another tool, again, and we talked about this with some of the safe sport in the interviews, is I have been involved where we've used interviews with the nominations committee as well too, because it actually gives you a sense for if coming onto the board, they're the bigger picture thinker, or if they want to be a doer in the organization. And that doer may be that they're more suited to that committee than the board. And again, this is when you think back to the size and composition of the board and making it work for your club. That committee may play a role in that. I would say assessment of skills and gaps is another tool that boards can use for succession planning. And again, harder to do at that local level, I think, sometimes than the provincial or the national level in a sport organization, but still important to begin that shift away, if we're moving away from the nominations from the floor, looking at the skills that exist around that board table and what are our gaps, right? You know, is it a gap around legal expertise, human resource expertise, right? And it's not that we're actually necessarily using those skills at the board table so that the experience of a lawyer is actually being a lawyer for the club, but they're bringing that thinking and that strategic thinking to the board table. And that's the purpose of sort of that skills piece, right? But it will help you identify some of those skills that you want to have around the board. I would say the other critical piece around board succession planning is just consistent processes around conflict of interest and disclosure of such. We all have a conflict around the board table, usually if we're involved at the local level or the club level, because we're either involved in the club or we have children that are involved in the club. But being able to manage that, I think, is a critical piece. And I think the other one we talked about, a screening questionnaire as a tool alongside of a police record check. A board screening questionnaire can be a great tool as well too, right? So it's a way to just have that consistent process to make sure that we're bringing the right people on to the board. Oh, that's Chris posting stuff in the chat. Sorry, I thought there was one big long question there. So that's just a few little tips around board succession planning. Like I said, we could do an entire 2-hour session on board governance for cycling clubs. And I don't know if Chris has maybe engaged Steve or someone else to take a look at that, but that's something that we can do. So I know it's the bottom of the hour. I've got through everything that I wanted to share with you. And now I guess I would open it up to questions from the group.
I'll jump in with one question around the nominations committee aspect. Would you suggest for clubs or for organizations that nominations committee is primarily made up of or entirely made up of the, let's say, the current board, or should it be people who aren't on the board, you know, who maybe have an outside view?
Yeah, so I would say, and again, this may be where we apply slightly different sort of processes at a local level versus a provincial level versus a national level. What I can share with you for the provincial organization that I stepped away from in the fall, the nominations committee we had was a committee of the board, but it was not comprised of the board. So what we did is we utilized people that were not sitting currently on the board. So past presidents are a good one, past members of the board, because they have a really good understanding of the board, to be on that nominations committee to help identify people to come in. I would say at your club level, you may not have that breadth of volunteers or that breadth of people to be able to do that. but ideally they should not be individuals that would be up for election in that year, in that case. So they should be, if your elections are on an every other year basis, it should be those folks that are not currently up for election. But ideally, a nominations committee that reports up into the board, but is not comprised of the board, I would say would be your ideal situation. But since we're talking about volunteer recruitment and retainment, we don't want to stress the group out by thinking they have to, you know, fill additional volunteer roles. So any other questions that anybody has? Comments?
That was me again.
Yeah, that's okay.
So we do
for a
have one. Yeah.
nonprofit board, can you expand a bit more about what's relevant conflict of interest and what isn't? So I would say a conflict, we're all really at the local level in a conflict of interest if we belong to the organization or we have kids that are in the organization. So I would say what's important to remember in that situation is that when we come to the board table, we come with our board hat off and not our individual interests as an individual, right? You know, so if you're talking about age groups or that type of thing that may, you know, if you got a child in a certain age group, I would say where there may be additional conflicts of interest on a not-for-profit board may be if you are, say, tendering for a service, so you're buying jerseys, you're purchasing something and you may have a board member that is an owner of a business or connected, they would have a conflict of interest and they would need to declare that and either not be a part of that, or you would look at other service providers to do that, right? So I don't know if that helps, Michael, in what you're looking for around relevant. I would say recognizing that, you know, at a local setting that most people would have a conflict, you know, and understanding that. And again, if people could come with that bigger picture board hat on so that they're not bringing their personal interests around the board table would be really important, right? And that's something that the president or the chair of that board should be working with the board members on. Great.
Any other questions? Cheryl was incredibly thorough, so
there's a lot of information for an hour. So yeah, and I guess the only thing I would just finish with before we close off is I appreciate that it's not always an easy role to bring people in to organizations to do volunteer tasks for us, and we've all been in that position. And again, I believe many of you are the volunteers that are looking to place volunteers, so have a great sort of appreciation of that. I guess I would, you know, the one thing I would sort of offer you to think about, and, you know, I think the timing is great as we come out of this pandemic as well, too, is there a way that we can do things differently as well? And I don't know the sport of cycling as well as I know, say, the sport of swimming, where I had my kids involved. But I can tell you that for the officials on the pool deck, there has got to be a better way of doing that, right? And so if the pandemic has taught us anything, it's, you know, how can we look at maybe doing things or running things slightly differently, not to compromise our programs and services, but I would offer a challenge rather than just reverting back to what we know as normal, and we all want to go back to that normal. What is it that we can do to maybe move the organization forward in a different way and challenge our thinking in a little bit different way as well, too? I don't have the answers for you. I know you know your clubs better than I know your clubs, and that may be a great conversation to have around the board table for any of you that are board members going forward. So anyway, I leave that with you to think about, not to feel overwhelmed, but just to think, is there a way that we can be doing things differently, right? Because people are burnt out, and we know that, right? And you know, is there a way that we can maybe engage and work with people in different ways? So anyway, I leave that with you. Yeah.
There's two other questions quickly, because I know you've got an out. First one is the presentation available? Your presentation tonight, can we make that available?
Yeah, I will PDF it and send it to you, Chris, and you can send it out. Yeah.
Fantastic. The second one is from Michael regarding volunteers. Where is the line between paying a volunteer stipend versus a salary?
Well, a volunteer, so I think this would be where we talk about our incentives, right? So the true definition of a volunteer is that they would not be receiving any remuneration, right? So by stipend, if you mean like an honorarium, or I guess it would depend on the role, right? And if that would be a conflict for them to accept that, if it was truly a volunteer role. So what I can think of, when I think of the example of swimming, and Chris, jump in if you have an example that you could use for cycling, but in the swimming world, all of the officials were volunteers, right? Including our referees, right? And so there was ethical or sort of an understanding that a ref would not accept a gift, right? So that we couldn't pay them for their time. We could pay them for any out-of-pocket expenses. So if they had to travel and we were reimbursing for mileage or reimbursing for the hotel, right? So those out-of-pocket expenses, but we wouldn't necessarily be remunerating them for their time. So I guess I'd have to understand a little bit more, Michael, what you were after, whether it was at those out-of-pocket expenses or if you're actually thinking of an honorarium, which in that case, you're probably looking at that individual being in more of a contractual relationship than a strictly volunteer relationship. And then I would just, depending on what that role is, be cautious around sort of any employment standards or anything related that way. So I don't know if that answers the question. Yeah, he said it does. So perfect.
Well, I'll thank you, Cheryl, again, and thank everyone for coming out tonight. For those of you that are still in there, I did put some links to some of the upcoming webinars this week, including one on Thursday that Cheryl will also be here for regarding financial literacy management. So I will let her get to her next appointment, but thank you again, everyone, for coming tonight. And I hope to see you guys either tomorrow at our insurance program summary webinar or on Thursday with Cheryl again. Again, if you have any questions, also don't hesitate to email us at the office at support@ontariocycling.org. Everybody have a great night, and I'm sure we'll chat soon. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, everybody. Good night. All right. We're all good. Thanks, Chris.